Good evening and welcome to New York City Atheists Live on Tape, brought to you by New York City Atheists Incorporated. I'm your host, Dennis Horvitz, the David Letterman of the Hopelessly Damned. No doubt many of you have been asking yourselves, what does paganism have to do with our holiday celebrations? Well, I know you've been staying up late at night worrying about this, and as usual, we've come to your rescue. Don't thank us. To address this question, our topic today is Wicca and Neopaganism, tribal and spiritualism for today's world. What do paganism, the solstice, and Christmas have in common? Quite a bit, apparently, and who better to explain these similarities than a pagan? So, our guest today is Margot Adler, Margot. See that? We're not going to edit this either because we're just so open and honest about our shortcomings. That's what I told my ex-girlfriend. Okay, very bad. It is. Oh, by the way, we are broadcasting from our winter solstice party. So this is hell on earth if you happen to be aware. So our guest today is Margot Adler, the granddaughter of the famous psychoanalyst Dr. Alfred Adler. She attended the University of California at Berkeley and the Columbia School of Journalism. She is a reporter for National Public Radio in New York City and a regular voice on NPR's Morning Edition and All Things Considered. Ms. Adler is the author of this book, Drawing Down the Moon, Witches, Druids, Goddess Worshippers, and Other Pagans in America Today, which I will try not to get my fingers on the title. You can just do a close-up of that. It's considered a watershed in American neo-pagan circles as it provides the first comprehensive look at modern nature-based religions in the United States. She was raised by atheist parents in New York City, but craved ritual and spirituality in her life. After graduation from college, she discovered a whole movement of people who were reviving and resurrecting in modern form the ancient pagan religions. Calling themselves witches, goddess people, druids, they practice an undogmatic tribal religion based on doing as opposed to creed-based scripture-oriented religions, which are mostly about believing. To borrow a phrase from Abraham Lincoln, it is altogether fitting and proper to have a pagan as our guest at our winter solstice party and to explain the ancient religion of paganism, its rites and rituals, and how neo-paganism fits into today's world. Please welcome Margot Adler.
So anyway, let me go back to the history for a minute. So what happened was Margaret Murray was this writer, as I said. She came up with these books, The Witch Cult in Western Europe. She said that, in fact, that all the persecutions of witches, that there had really been this ancient pagan underground view. And so what happened then was a lot of people in England went, oh, I think my great-grandmother did a little work like that. Oh, we must be witches. Oh, and so they started creating the first modern covens. And a lot of it was just sort of fiction. You know, I mean, they got a little folklore, they got a little this, they got a little that. They created some covens. Then along came a guy named Gerald Gardner. Gerald Gardner was a fascinating guy. He was a civil servant in India, a British civil servant in India. He had mucked around the Far East. He had studied, Malay weapons. He had hung out a little bit with Aleister Crowley. He had done all kinds of wild stuff. And he came back, he finished his tour of duty. He came back to the United States. And he claimed, still not clear what any of this is true, but he claimed that he had found in the New Forest in England these old people whose ways were dying out, and that he had found this witch's coven, and he was going to, and then he was going to, make these views public. He published a few books. One of them's called, Witchcraft Today. The Meaning of Witchcraft is another. And he started a museum on the Isle of Man. And believe it or not, all these witchcraft covens started happening all over the country. All over England first. They came to the United States. They multiplied. They got different traditions. Another guy named Alexanders did stuff. And now there are probably 70, 80 different traditions of witchcraft and Wicca in the United States based on different ideas and stuff like that. Probably a lot of them going back to, whether they admit it or not, some of the stuff that happened in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, or whatever in England, whether or not they're saying this is true or not. But what he had glommed onto was some very interesting ideas, that if you have 12 people, 10 people, 12 people, just about the good size of a therapy group, and you get them together in a circle, and you light some candles and incense, and you can have some really beautiful things happen. And so he created, and he and a woman named Doreen Valiente, who doesn't get nearly the credit, but probably wrote half of the beautiful rituals, he and a bunch of other people created a whole bunch of and that's sort of how Wicca happened. The whole idea of Wicca sort of came out of England, came out of the folklore movement and all that. That's sort of how it happened. And then what happened is around 1970 in the United States, a whole other group of people, women, suddenly said, wait a minute, we don't need to be initiated. We don't need all this stuff and all this formality and all this lady so-and-so and lord so-and-so and all this kind of stuff. We're women, therefore, all we have to do is say, I'm a witch, I'm a witch, I'm a witch, and guess what? We're witches, because we are women, we are into, etc. So the entire feminist movement created a whole new form of spirituality. It took stuff from everywhere. It took stuff from Silva mind control and renamed it. It took stuff from Eureka. It took stuff here and there and there. And it created the first dyadic. In the 1970s, the first coven was by Z. Budapest. It was called the Susan B. Anthony Coven Number 1. And it was in Los Angeles. And it was, it was like the first, and so a whole movement began of women looking at witch in a completely different way. And for them, the whole word was power, women's power, that there was something innately powerful about being a woman, about understanding nature in a certain way, about looking at the ancient women healers, looking at the midwives, thinking about what they had done. And basically, an entire huge movement of women's spirituality came about. What first also happened at that same time was the consciousness raising group was happening. So when first the consciousness raising group, if those of you who remembered it, I was in one in 1972, the consciousness raising group basically said this, it got a group of women together, you didn't interrupt. Sometimes it was the first time women had not been interrupted in their lives. It's hard for people who are under 40 to remember this, but it was impossible for a woman to go into a restaurant and actually sit at a restaurant alone without being accosted. It was a very different time. And so these consciousness raising groups would sit around, let's say 10 women, there'd be a topic of the night, like, my mother, or menstruation, or my first, or all kinds of stuff. You can imagine. High school, whatever it might be. And you would go around and you'd start talking about what it meant to you, completely uninterrupted. And from those meetings came a real knowledge base that they were much more alike than they realized, that they had this incredible thing in common, and that slogan, the personal is political. They came up with the slogan that the personal was political, that essentially from their own lives came this notion of what needed to be done. Well, after those consciousness raising grew up, the next stage in that was women started doing research on women's history. And they started going all the way back and thinking, well, were there matriarchies? Were there not matriarchies? They started doing all this research, and then they started forming spiritual groups and saying, well, if the personal is political, well, maybe the spiritual is personal, maybe the spiritual is political. They started like merging all this stuff together, and suddenly you had this huge movement of women's spirituality, which is a little less today than it was, but it still has, a lot of stuff going on with it. So you have the witches from England, who are all very formal. You have, and then you have the women's spirituality people, all the stuff doing research on the ancient goddesses. Was there one ancient goddess of old, or were there millions of them, and stuff like that. And at the same time that this was happening, all the people going back to their religious roots of their ancestors is happening at the same time. So you have people looking into Norse religion, people looking into ancient Egyptian religion, people looking into the Druids, etc. And this entire movement collectively is what I am calling the contemporary or neo-pagan movement. And it has many different traditions in it. It has many different ideas within it. But I think ultimately, when you get down to it, the most important thing that it has is the notion that you don't have to proselytize, that religion is multiple, that there are different paths to reality, and that's good. And basically that the sacred resides ultimately in the here and now. And for me, those are the most important things, and that you can have fun. And I'll leave you with a famous song that goes around the pagan movement all the time, which is called their version of Give Me That Old Time Religion. Now, you all know Give Me That Old Time Religion, you know, sung by every Christian group in the world, you know, but we sing it a little differently. And so we sing it like this. We shall worship like the Druids, running naked through the woods, drinking strange fermented fluids, and that's good enough for me. Give me that old-time religion. Give me that old-time religion. Give me that old-time religion. It's good enough for me. And there are about 1,000 verses of this, you know. It's good enough for ISIS. She was nifty in a crisis. There was, you know, I mean, and she hasn't raised her prices. You know, I mean, you can do one for every god that ever existed. You know, it's really fun. So I think I'm open to questions at this point.
Thank you very much. I think after that we're going to be defining ourselves as pagans. I want to throw open a question, but I actually do have a couple of questions on my own, and just for clarification. Early on in your book, you have a sentence here that was, I guess, from your friend Michael, where he says, "Magic is simply the art of getting results."
Oh, well, Michael, that's the whole other story. But anyway, Mike, yeah.
Well, my question is, and I freely admit that I've just started reading your book, so
right.
Clear. If framed in that context, how does it kind of differentiate from anything? Because at least taking it at face value, anything could be magic.
Now, well, I'll tell you that story. I mean, Michael turned out to be sort of a con man in the end, and that's a whole other story. But I met this guy, Michael. He was a witch. He was a priest. He was one of these very charismatic characters. And in the context of researching my book, which my book has been out now. I mean, it came out in '79 and has been revised several times as the movement has changed, because the movement is actually very different now than it was in 1979, which we can also talk about and in what ways it has changed. Most of the lectures I go around giving to people who are sort of in the movement is what's different now. But anyway, Michael lived in very, very rural Colorado, and he was, you know, the kind of person who I actually didn't like. He was a little too dogmatic for my taste. But he basically told us that we had to go out and get fish for that our task for the day, and the task for his group, they lived on a farm, was to go down to this river, and we were supposed to get enough fish. The fish were dying, the river was drying up, but the fish were still alive, and somehow or another we were going to get enough fish to fill this truck with a fertilizer on it, to use for fertilizer. So we went down to the thing with a couple of buckets, and we started trying to catch the fish, and they were running away. And by the time 2 hours were done, there were no fish. Then we had 2 buckets of fish. Certainly not a truck full. So he then gave us this long lecture in which he said, magic is getting results. And then he made us go through this thing. He made us imagine ourselves that we were hungry bears. And he made us imagine that we really needed these fish. And we had to go down and sort of act, what would we do if we were a bear and we had to go down? And so we went back down to the river. And suddenly, we went back down to the river, and we suddenly started thinking about ourselves as bears. We went into the river up to here, whereas before we had just been doing little, and we just went, and we'd catch a fish and throw it onto the beach. And you start doing this kind of weird bear-like exercise in which we were doing this stuff, and an hour later we had a truckload of fish. So what he was trying to say was, and again, it's something that I think you can think of as very psychological. It really had nothing to do with the supernatural, but it was changing your whole way of thinking. It was like let me just say very quickly, I think a lot of these things that we think of as a cult, like the tarot or the I Ching or all these kind of things, that what they're really about has nothing to do with the supernatural. What they're really about is you're stuck in a situation. You don't know what to do. So you read you do some I Ching thing, and suddenly your mind is open to looking for an answer everywhere. And by God, sometimes an answer comes. It's amazing. Or I should say by goddess or by gods or by anything. But anyway,
by mind.
Now, by mind. Let me tell you, mind control had a technique. Silva Mind Control, never forget it. They said, do the following. You need the answer to a question. You take a glass of water. You fill it up. You drink a third of it, you put it in the refrigerator, and then, you know, probably you're going to get the answer in a dream or a this or a that. And then if it doesn't happen the next, you know, in the morning, you go and you drink another third. And then if the answer hasn't come, you know, when you come back home before you go to sleep, you drink the third. Well, what was that about? What that was about was you had no idea where the answer was coming, but by drinking that water, you were suddenly, every page of the book, you know, you were saying, oh, where's my answer? Where's my answer? Oh, maybe it will come from a dream. You would open up your mind to be receptive to, you know, answers coming from friends, from everywhere, whereas you had been closed before. So again, I think it's a very psychological explanation of magic.
So in other words, it's like a means of focus.
Exactly. I think it's all about, you know, what the Buddhists talk about, attention, concentration, all that stuff, and allowing yourself to be in a certain receptive situation.
Yeah. Before I forget, I just want to just focus in on this again. Her book.
I didn't bring them.
Is Drawing Down the Moon.
Should have brought them.
Witches, druids, goddesses, worshippers, and other pagans in America. Margot Adler. And she's with us today, so if you've just tuned in, we're taking question and answers. Margot has just given us a little talk about paganism in America, and we're taking question and answers from the audience. And we're going to try to go through this fast so that you can get back to your chocolate mousse.
Oh my God, there it is, yes.
This might be self-selection bias, but a lot of people I know who identify as pagans or Wiccas are female. Out there, are there more women? There seems to be sort of a perhaps matriarchal bias.
The question is there more women in paganism, and is there a matriarchal bias? Because, as I said, one strand of that is this feminist, Dianic, matriarchal kind of focus that I was talking about with women's spirituality. That clearly is going to have mostly women. The traditional witchcraft stuff that came from England and all that kind of stuff has as many, well, no, maybe I'd say maybe it's more like 60-40 women over men. And what I would call the revival of these other religions, the Norse, the whatever, is basically 50-50. So I would say that when you go to a festival, and now what happens with a lot of these pagans is there are a lot of festivals where people meet, camp out festivals and so forth. I would say those festivals are pretty much equal male and female, and also lots of kids. That's a whole new thing. Families, that was never true. When we first got involved in this movement in the 60s, it was all, you know, kind of 60s hippies and stuff. No longer.
Well, that's what happens when you get drunk and naked. Putting towards a family usually happen. You know, it's a normal...
normal result, yes.
I also noticed in your book you differentiate your pagans from Satanists.
Oh, okay. Satanists, okay.
I have a personal fondness for them. That's why.
Well, I think there are Satanists and Satanists.
That's right. That's
the first thing. There's a lot of misinformation about Satanists.
Right.
Because a lot of Satanists are really doing certainly LaVey was really doing a kind of self-oriented, you know, it had nothing to do with it.
And he did it with a touch of irony.
A touch of irony and so forth.
Big touch.
But the basic rap that we give when we're talking and, you know, the minister comes up and says, aren't you Satanists and so forth. But as we say, that we don't use Christian terminology for anything that we do. And most Satanists are sort of enmeshed in some way in Christianity. So they turn Christian symbols upside down. So you'd have the upside down cross, you have the, you know, and in some way, or the Lord's Prayer backwards. All that assumes a Christian focus from the beginning and then a rebellion against Christianity. We're coming from a prior place, from the before Christianity place, which is not an anti-Christianity place as much as saying, if we wanted to be ironic, we're living through the 2,000-year Christian interlude.
Right. No, very good point. But the reason I even mentioned Satanists is because I don't have an extensive knowledge of them, but from what I understand, if you would use the term mainstream Satanists, is that they're also primarily concerned with the ritual and the psychological aspects of it.
And psychology is very big. And one of the most interesting articles I ever read, and this was a long, long time ago in a big Princeton anthology on religion, was one of these big anthropological studies of a Satanist group, in which they showed how what its main purpose was to take kids who were just incredibly shy and nerdy and couldn't deal with anything, and by the time they had actually been in this group for 6 months, they were actually functioning normally, going out on dates, etc. Wow. So it was like, it really had nothing to do with anything else.
Satanic fellowship and
right, exactly.
revival. Yeah, so it's not necessarily even anti-God.
Right,
right. Yes, sir.
Next question is, I'd like you to just continue with the idea. You said that there's a difference between the paganism of the 70s and present day.
And the paganism in the 70s and now. What's happened is that the paganism that I first got involved in the 70s, well, first of all, we were still coming out of the 60s and the 70s, and so there was much more of a sense of rebellion. And now what you have is a much more mainstream movement, or a movement that's trying to mainstream itself. So, for example, there is now a peer-reviewed pagan scholarly magazine called Pomegranate. There are now pagan studies courses in universities. There are now pagan chaplains in prisons. There was a huge fight that finally was won with Barry Lynn of Americans United to basically get the pentacle to be on gravestones along with the atheist symbol and everything. They would not allow the pentacle on gravestones at Arlington and everywhere else. And that was a huge fight, and the Bush administration essentially had fought that, and Barry Lynn and Selena Fox of Circle and some other people basically did a 10-year fight that finally won that one. There still is a huge fight to get pagan military chaplains. Still has not happened yet. There are now pagan charities, never existed. There were, when people were alcoholics and they were in the pagan movement, they found no resources, and they'd end up going back to their church or go back to their this, that, and the other. And there are now pagan AA groups that have modified the 10 to 12 steps so that it's not Christian in a certain way, and they've sort of changed those steps. There is now a huge number of pagans in the Unitarian Universalist Church that has become, just as it has with gay people, a somewhat welcoming congregation for pagans. And in fact, it had 6 principles, and it added a 7th principle, which was that that it supported religions that believed in sort of the circle of life and so forth and so on, and so sort of brought in both Native American and pagan religions into it. There are many more children now within the pagan traditions. The Council, what's it called? The Parliament of World Religions, which meets every 5 years or so, was in Barcelona last, is going to Melbourne, Australia next year, started out in Chicago or whatever, and was probably 100 years ago, was the organization that brought Eastern religions into the United States. Now there's a huge pagan presence at the Parliament of World Religions, and that is in Australia. It's not only going to be the contemporary pagans who are going to go down there and force, but are going to be bringing and meeting with Aborigines and stuff like that, and trying to kind of figure out a lot of stuff there. So I would say that the main difference is that there's an attempt to see this as not just this weird aberration of hippie people who want to have some fun, but to try to figure out how do we connect in the real world as an ongoing concern.
Has the worldview deepened in any way or changed, or is it basically?
I would say that the worldview has a lot of sort of hard to know, because there's a lot of controversies within the different groups. There are some groups who don't even like to use the word pagan. The Norse people don't consider themselves pagans, but yet I include them. There are a lot of people who are arguing about, there's just a lot of differentiation and argument, but I would say that the main difference is that this is now a movement that understands that it's multi-generational. And because of that, it has to deal, as other religions do, with multi-generational needs. So, for example, in the 60s and 70s, no one talked about death. No one talked about death. So there weren't funeral ceremonies, pagan funeral ceremonies. Now people are starting to talk about, well, we had all these camp-out festivals, but now a lot of people can't be camping out because we have people in their 70s and 75 who can't really get to some of these kind of campgrounds. There suddenly is talk about Do we create our own, old age homes, and, do we do some co-housing? Do we, I mean, those kind of questions that were never on the agenda. I would say it's just that suddenly there's this broadening out in a way that wasn't true before.
So the institutionalization?
I would say so. And the bad part about that, I think the one thing that I find worrisome about that is that I came into it because I wanted a rebellion. I mean, I really wanted an alternative view to the society as a whole. And as I watch this, I want to be very careful, because I think to myself, I don't want this just to be another ordinary religion that has all the trappings of everything else. If this isn't an alternative, why am I in it? So, and people have noted, for example, that some of the more kinky things, at some of these festivals in the 70s, there'd be workshops on sex magic, and and now it's all been cleaned up because there's so many kids around, well, it's good in a way, but then there are people who say, well, are we losing something, so it's that kind of tug.
I'm just dying to know. I'm assuming you're a Reformed pagan as opposed to Orthodox.
I am a very eclectic.
Here's
what my story is essentially. I started out in this very traditional British group. I could not deal with it, and I finally left it. I mean, I'm still considered an elder in this Gardnerian movement. I'm still considered an elder. I have, there are people who call me grandma because I've, down the line of all these different covens. But truthfully, I got more personal oomph from the feminist stuff and from all the stuff that I was doing, just eclectic. And now at this point, I don't have a group. I'm not running a group. I do a yearly solstice, I did it last weekend, event with another woman for women that we do in Northern Connecticut. I lecture, give workshops, etc., etc. But I really, I'm just sort of an eclectic, solitary pagan out there right now.